Have you ever noticed as a philosopher that, like, when we talk about politics, we kind of get lost in the details of policy, you know? And we maybe forget to think about, like, the deeper structure of how we're even thinking about these problems.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's almost like we're trying to decide,
Yeah,
the best way to decorate a house when the foundation's all wonky.
that's a good analogy. And so today we're doing something a little bit different for you, our listener, and you're a philosopher who's given us some Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy sources on Michael Oakeshott.
Okay.
So we're going to do a deep dive into Oakeshott's thought.
Yeah.
And we're not just going to skim the surface. We're going to go deep into his core ideas. And so while we will touch on his political ideas, this isn't just political philosophy. This is about how we understand the world in general.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, Oakeshott really was concerned with like the fundamental structures of how we think and how that influences everything else.
Right, like the architecture of thought itself.
Yeah.
So specifically, we're going to explore his theory of modes of experience, his critique of rationalism, his understanding of the modern state through what he calls civil association, and even his philosophy of history.
Wow, that's a lot to cover.
It is a lot to cover. But all these ideas, they're not just isolated concepts. They're actually tools that we can use to understand the different ways that we approach knowledge in different fields, like almost like a logic of understanding.
That's a great way to think about it. Yeah, like each mode has its own kind of internal logic.
Yeah, and our mission is to extract the most insightful ideas from Oakeshott's work and show you how these ideas can illuminate the deeper questions in philosophy, which was something that he was very concerned with himself.
And I think especially as a philosopher, those deeper questions, those foundational questions are always going to be at the forefront.
Right, so let's just jump into it. Okay, so first things first, modes of experience. Now, when Oakeshott talks about his experience, he's not just talking about sensory data like what we see and hear and touch.
Right. He's not just talking about like passive observation. He's talking about experience as an active process where the person experiencing and the thing being experienced, they're like two sides of the same coin. They can't be separated.
Okay, so it's like the act of experiencing is just as important as the thing being experienced.
Exactly. And that act of experiencing always involves our thinking and the ideas that we bring to the table.
Yeah.
He was definitely drawing on that Hegelian idea of the subject-object relationship.
So as a philosopher, you would say that it's not just I see a tree.
Right.
It's I see a tree and I'm applying the concept of tree to that experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that concept, that framework that you're using to understand the tree is part of the experience itself.
Okay, so that's experience now. How does that lead to this idea of modes of thought?
So from this idea of experience, Oakeshott develops the idea of a mode of thought. And for him, this is like a body of ideas that fits together in a really coherent way.
Okay, so like a self-contained system of thought.
Exactly. And these modes of thought, they become distinct from other ways of thinking. They kind of develop their own internal logic and their own criteria for what counts as true and real.
Okay, now the Stanford Encyclopedia says that these modes are autonomous.
Right.
What does that mean for a philosopher who's interested in how we know things?
Well, basically, it means that each mode sets its own terms. It's like having different sets of rules for different games.
Yeah.
You can't play baseball using the rules of basketball.
Right.
And you can't really judge what's true or false in one mode by using the standards of another mode. They're kind of incommensurable.
So it's like they're speaking different languages.
Yeah, exactly. Like imagine you're trying to have a conversation with someone who only speaks French and you only speak Spanish. You're both saying words. They don't mean the same thing to each of you.
Okay, so this idea of autonomy is really important for a philosopher because it means we have to be careful about the kind of assumptions we're making when we're talking about different things.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're trying to have a debate about history using the language of science, you're probably going to miss the point.
Right. The encyclopedia also mentions that these modes are wholes of interlocking meanings with their own criteria for truth, factuality, and reality.
Mm-hmm.
So each mode has its own epistemology.
Right, exactly. And its own ontology, too. Like what counts as a fact in history might not count as a fact in science.
Okay, so this brings up a really interesting question for a philosopher. If these modes are so distinct and they operate by their own rules, how do they relate to each other?
That's a good question. So Oakeshott says that these modes don't really argue with each other. They converse.
Okay, what does he mean by converse?
So when he says converse, he's thinking about these modes as ideal types.
Okay.
And so the conversation happens in the differences and juxtapositions that we see between these ideal types and how they actually show up in the world.
So it's like in practice, these modes are never perfectly pure.
Right. They're always influencing each other.
Yeah.
And so the conversation is in that interplay, that tension between the ideal and the real.
Okay, so the key takeaway here for a philosopher is that it's not about trying to find one single truth that applies to everything.
Right.
It's about understanding how these different modes contribute to our overall understanding.
Exactly. And respecting those differences.
Okay, now the encyclopedia highlights some key modes that are particularly relevant to a philosopher. So let's go through them. The first one is practice, and this seems relevant to ethics.
Yeah, so practice is all about the kind of thinking that we do when we're acting in the world.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It's about knowing how to navigate social situations, how to make judgments in the moment, how to get things done.
Okay, so it's about practical knowledge.
Right, and a lot of that knowledge is tacit. It's the kind of stuff that we learn through experience, not through textbooks.
Okay, so for a philosopher, this would be similar to the idea of practical reason.
Absolutely, and it connects to those debates about the role of habit and tradition in shaping our actions.
Okay, then there's history, and this is one that you're an expert in. So for a philosopher who's interested in knowledge, how does Oakeshott define history as a mode of inquiry?
Well, for Oakeshott, history is a distinct way of knowing the past. It's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Okay.
It's about constructing a coherent narrative of what happened based on the available evidence.
Okay, so it's about interpretation.
Exactly. The historian is like a detective trying to piece together a story from clues that are often incomplete and unreliable.
So for a philosopher, history is not just a collection of facts, it's a way of making sense of those facts.
Absolutely. And it has its own standards for what counts as good evidence and a good explanation.
Okay, and then we have science.
Right.
So how does Oakeshott see science as a distinct mode of thought?
So science for Oakeshott is all about finding general laws and relationships that can explain and predict events in the natural world.
Okay, so it's about finding patterns.
Exactly, and using those patterns to make predictions and control outcomes.
Okay, so it's very different from history in that sense.
Absolutely. History is about understanding the particular and the unique,
Right.
while science is about finding the general and the universal.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia places Oakeshott within the German Neo-Kantian tradition, which distinguish between natural sciences and the human sciences.
Right, so the natural sciences are those that study the natural world, while the human sciences study human beings and their creations.
And this seems particularly relevant for a philosopher who's thinking about the different ways that we can study ourselves and the world around us.
Absolutely. Yeah, it gets into these big questions about the nature of knowledge and whether the same methods can be used to study both the natural and the human.
Right, and then the final mode that we'll talk about is poetry.
Right.
Now, this isn't just about writing poems, it's about a certain kind of aesthetic experience.
Yeah, so poetry for Oakeshott is about engaging with beauty and form and imagination.
Okay, so it's about appreciating things for their own sake, not for some practical purpose.
Exactly. It's about those moments where we're just captivated by something, whether it's a piece of music or a painting or a sunset.
Okay, now the encyclopedia points out that these modal distinctions are categorical, meaning they're differences in kind, not just degree.
Right. It's not like history is just a less precise version of science.
Yeah.
They're fundamentally different ways of thinking with different goals and different standards of evaluation.
And this is a really important point for a philosopher who's thinking about ontology and epistemology.
Yeah, it gets into those really deep questions about the nature of reality and how we can know it.
Right, like are these categories just ways that we organize our experience, or do they reflect something about the structure of reality itself?
Exactly. And Oakeshott leans towards the view that these modes are not just arbitrary categories. They reflect the way that human understanding works.
Okay, so he's not saying that there's one true mode of thought that we should all be striving for.
Right. He's saying that these different modes each have their own value and their own limitations.
And that's important for us to remember as philosophers, that we shouldn't try to reduce everything to one single way of thinking.
Absolutely. We need to be open to different perspectives and different ways of understanding the world.
Okay, now the encyclopedia lists a few implications of Oakeshott's theory of modes for philosophical inquiry. The first one is that understanding is autonomous within each mode, meaning truth is about internal coherence.
Right. So it's not about comparing one mode to another and saying one is more true than the other.
Okay.
It's about looking at the internal logic of each mode and seeing if it holds together.
So it's like judging a building by its own structural integrity.
Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't judge a skyscraper by the same standards as a mud hut.
Okay, and the second implication is that the relationship between modes is conversational yielding differences, not supramodal conclusions.
Right. It's not about trying to find some ultimate truth that transcends all the modes.
Okay.
It's about letting the modes speak to each other and seeing what new insights emerge from that dialogue.
And this connects to the idea of modes as distinct voices in a conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like each mode has its own perspective and its own insights to offer.
And the third implication is that there's no extra modal definition of rationality.
Right, so what counts as rational depends on the mode of thought that you're using.
Okay, so there's no universal standard of reason that applies to everything.
Exactly, and this is a challenge to a lot of traditional philosophy that tries to find a single overarching theory of rationality.
Right, and Oakeshott sees this as a problem because it leads to all sorts of Gnostisms like Doricism, scientism, and pragmatism.
Yeah, basically when you privilege one mode over all the others, you end up distorting your understanding of the world.
Right, and the encyclopedia even says that insisting on one mode as superior is boorish and barbaric.
Well, yeah, it's like going into someone's house and telling them that their way of decorating is wrong just because it's not your style.
Okay, and the fourth implication is that there's no hierarchy of modes.
Right. No one mode is inherently better or more true than any other.
Okay, and this is really important for a philosopher who's interested in pluralism.
Absolutely. It means that we need to be respectful of different ways of knowing and understanding the world.
Now, the encyclopedia contrasts Oakeshott with other idealist thinkers like Croce and Collingwood.
Right?
And they point out that Collingwood, in his book Speculum Mentis, proposed a hierarchy of modes with philosophy at the top.
Right. He thought that philosophy had a special role in synthesizing all the other modes into a unified understanding of reality.
But Oakeshott rejects this kind of hierarchical thinking.
Absolutely. He sees philosophy as a distinct mode of inquiry, but not one that's superior to any other.
Right. He sees philosophy as a kind of meta-inquiry that reflects on the presuppositions of all the other modes, but it doesn't try to create a grand synthesis.
Exactly. He's more interested in understanding the differences between the modes than in trying to unify them.
And the encyclopedia links this to Oakeshott's later distinction between conditional and unconditional theorizing.
Right. So conditional theorizing is thinking within a particular mode, accepting its assumptions and its limitations.
Okay.
While unconditional theorizing is stepping outside of all the modes and questioning the very foundations of our thinking.
So philosophy for Oakeshott is a kind of unconditional theorizing.
Exactly. It's about questioning the assumptions that we normally take for granted.
Okay, so this is a really important distinction for a philosopher to keep in mind.
Absolutely. It reminds us that all knowledge is provisional and that we should always be open to revising our beliefs.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Oakeshott's theory of modes of experience.
Yeah.
And I think we have a pretty good understanding of how that works.
Yeah, I think so.
So let's move on to his critique of rationalism now. As a philosopher who values reason, we need to be careful about how we understand what Oakeshott is critiquing here.
Right. He's not saying that reason is bad.
Right.
He's critiquing a specific way of using reason that he calls rationalism.
Okay, so what is rationalism for Oakeshott?
So for Oakeshott, rationalism is the belief that we can find correct answers to practical questions by applying abstract rules and principles.
Okay, so it's about trying to find a formula for everything.
Exactly. And Oakeshott thinks that this is a mistake because it ignores the importance of practical judgment and experience.
Okay, he makes a distinction between technical knowledge and traditional knowledge.
Right. So technical knowledge is the kind of knowledge that we can learn from a book or a manual. It's explicit and codified.
Okay.
While traditional knowledge is the kind of knowledge that we acquire through experience, it's tacit and uncodified.
Okay, so for a philosopher, this might sound similar to the distinction between propositional knowledge and procedural knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. And Oakeshott is saying that we need both kinds of knowledge to make good judgments in the world.
Right. And he uses the example of Hart's no vehicles in the park rule.
Right.
To show how even seemingly simple rules require interpretation and judgment.
Exactly, like what counts as a vehicle, a bicycle, a skateboard, a baby stroller.
Right, the rule itself doesn't tell you.
You have to use your judgment to figure out how to apply the rule in different situations.
And Oakeshott argues that this is especially true in politics.
Right, political decisions are complex. There's no algorithm that can tell you what the right thing to do is.
Right, you have to weigh different values, different perspectives.
And you have to be able to make judgments in the face of uncertainty and incomplete information.
And this is where Oakeshott sees the danger of rationalism in politics.
Right, because rationalists tend to think that they can find a set of principles that will solve all our problems.
Okay, and Oakeshott thinks that this is an illusion.
Exactly. He thinks that political principles are always abstracted from particular historical circumstances.
Okay, and that they can't be applied mechanically to new situations.
Right. You always have to use judgment to figure out how to apply principles in a way that makes sense for the specific context.
And Oakeshott points out that even the rationalists themselves are relying on experience and judgment when they come up with their principles.
Exactly. They're just not always aware of it.
Right. And this is why Oakeshott is so critical of ideological politics.
Right, because ideologies are basically systems of abstract principles that are supposed to tell us how to live.
And Oakeshott thinks that this is a recipe for disaster.
Right, because when you try to impose an ideology on the world, you're inevitably going to run into problems because the world is messy and unpredictable.
And he critiques various figures like Locke Bentham and Marx for trying to derive political principles from abstract foundations, whether religious, scientific, or historical.
Exactly. He thinks that they're all trying to find a shortcut to political wisdom and that there is no shortcut.
He's very critical of this idea that political conclusions can be drawn from religion, science, or history as if they were blueprints for action.
Right. He thinks that those are different modes of thought and that they can't be used to dictate political decisions.
He also critiques Marxism specifically.
Yeah, he sees Marxism as more of a rhetoric than a science.
Right. He thinks that it's more about persuasion than about explanation.
Right, and that it relies on a kind of historical determinism that Oakeshott rejects.
And he also introduces this concept of telocracy,
Right.
which is the idea that the state has some kind of overarching purpose or goal.
Right, like achieving economic equality or creating a utopia.
And Oakeshott thinks that this is a dangerous idea.
Yeah, because it leads to the state trying to control every aspect of our lives.
Right, and this connects to Oakeshott's broader affirmation of the independence of theory from practice.
Right. He thinks that we need to keep these two realms separate.
Okay.
And that we shouldn't try to derive practical guidance from theoretical principles.
Right. He famously said, just as a theory of jokes is not itself a joke, the theory of morality is not itself a morality.
Exactly. And this is a really important point for a philosopher to keep in mind.
Okay.
Because it means that we need to be careful about how we apply philosophical ideas to the real world.
Okay, so that's Oakeshott's critique of rationalism.
Right.
Now let's move on to his idea of civil association. And this is where he introduces a new set of terms to describe the state.
Right. He wants to get away from the language of purpose and goals.
Okay, and he does this by drawing a distinction between civil association and enterprise association.
Right. So enterprise association is what we were just talking about. It's the idea that the state has a specific purpose or goal that it's trying to achieve.
Okay.
While civil association is the idea that the state is not about achieving any particular outcome. It's about providing a framework for individuals to pursue their own goals.
Okay, so it's about creating a space for individual freedom.
Exactly. And Oakeshott uses Latin terms to describe this kind of state. He talks about civitas, civis, and lex.
Okay, so civitas is the state.
Right.
Cives are the citizens,
Right.
and lex is the law.
Right.
And he's using these Latin terms because he wants to get away from the connotations of purpose and goal that are embedded in our normal English vocabulary.
Right. He wants to emphasize that the state is not a tool for achieving some specific end.
Right. It's a framework for enabling individuals to live together in peace and freedom.
Exactly. And so in a civil association, the civs are bound by common non-instrumental laws.
Now, for a philosopher who's thinking about the nature of law, what does it mean for a law to be non-instrumental?
Well, it means that the law is not a means to some other end. It's an end in itself.
Okay.
It's not about achieving some particular outcome. It's about upholding certain principles of justice and fairness.
Okay, so for example, a law against murder is not about reducing the crime rate. It's about protecting the right to life.
Exactly. And Oakeshott thinks that this is the kind of law that should characterize a civil association.
Now, the encyclopedia anticipates an objection here, which is that any state needs to have some instrumental laws to function.
Right, like laws about taxes and defense and infrastructure.
So is Oakeshott being unrealistic here?
Well, no, he acknowledges that in the real world, there's always going to be a mix of civil and enterprise elements in the state.
Okay.
But he's saying that we need to be clear about the distinction between these two types of association, and that we should strive to create a state that's primarily characterized by civil association.
So it's about finding the right balance.
Exactly.
And Oakeshott emphasizes that the authority of law in a civil association doesn't depend on the consent of the citizens.
Right. It's not about whether people agree with the law. It's about whether the law has been enacted properly and is being applied fairly.
So it's about the rule of law.
Exactly.
And Oakeshott defines the public concern or the commonwealth not as some kind of substantive goal that the state is trying to achieve,
Right.
but as the maintenance of this framework of rules and procedures that enables individuals to live together in peace and freedom.
Exactly. It's about preserving the conditions for civil association.
And Oakeshott acknowledges that this will involve providing certain substantive goods,
Right.
like police and courts and infrastructure.
Right.
But he emphasizes that these goods are not ends in themselves.
Right.
They're means to the end of preserving civil association. And Oakeshott also draws a distinction between moral and prudential modes of human relationship.
All right, so prudential relationships are based on self-interest,
Okay.
while moral relationships are based on a sense of obligation or duty.
Okay.
And Oakeshott thinks that the laws of a civil association should be moral in this sense.
Okay. So they're not about what's good for me as an individual. They're about what's good for us as a community.
Exactly. And Oakeshott describes telex the law as an ideal character,
Okay.
meaning it's an abstraction, not the concrete body of laws that exists in any particular state.
Okay.
And so his theory of civil association is not about prescribing a specific set of laws. It's about identifying the principles that should guide our thinking about law.
Okay. And this is where the idea of the rule of law becomes really important.
Right, because the rule of law is what ensures that the laws are applied fairly and impartially.
And Oakeshott sees the rule of law as essential for preserving civil association.
Absolutely. Without the rule of law, the state can easily become an instrument of tyranny. And so for Oakeshott, the rule of law is not just a nice idea. It's a necessary condition for a free and just society.
Now, the encyclopedia talks about the ambiguity thesis,
Right.
which is the idea that real-world states are always a mix of civil and enterprise elements.
Right. There's no such thing as a pure civil association.
And so for a philosopher who's looking for clear and distinct concepts, does this ambiguity create a problem?
Well, it does make things more complicated, but it doesn't invalidate Oakeshott's distinction.
Okay.
The distinction between civil and enterprise association is still a useful analytical tool.
Right.
It helps us to understand the different ways that states can be organized and the different values that they can prioritize.
And Oakeshott acknowledges that there will always be some enterprise elements in any state,
Right.
like the need to collect taxes and defend the borders.
Right.
But he emphasizes that these elements should be kept to a minimum
Right.
and that they should always be subordinate to the principles of civil association.
Ex-
And Oakeshott also emphasizes the importance of the persona associated with different roles in the state,
Right.
like the legislator, the judge, the
Yeah.
police officer.
Right.
And he says that these roles should be understood as having a distinct character in a civil association.
Right. Like the legislator is not just a policymaker who's trying to achieve some particular outcome.
Right.
There's someone who's articulating general rules that apply to everyone equally.
Right. And Oakeshott also distinguishes between the authority of law and the desirability of law.
Right. So the authority of law is about whether the law has been enacted properly,
Okay.
while the desirability of law is about whether the law is good or just.
Okay. And Oakeshott says that the desirability of law in a civil association is judged in relation to the moral, legal self-understanding of the community.
Right. It's not about some abstract standard of justice. It's about what the community recognizes as fair and right.
And this connects to the idea of the connected critic that we talked about earlier, where our judgments about justice are always rooted in our particular social and historical context.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's Oakeshott's idea of civil association.
Right.
Now let's move on to his philosophy of history.
Okay.
And he starts by reiterating his distinction between thinking to understand and thinking to act.
Right. He's saying that we need to keep these two modes of thought separate,
Okay.
and that when we're doing history, we should be focused on understanding the past, not on trying to draw lessons from it for the present.
Right. He thinks that the whole idea of the lessons of history is a mistake.
Exactly. It leads to us projecting our own values and concerns onto the past.
And Oakeshott also rejects the idea that history has a direction or a purpose.
Right. He doesn't believe in progress or decline.
Okay.
He thinks that history is just a series of contingent events.
Okay, so he's a critic of teleological views of history.
Absolutely. He thinks that they're based on a misunderstanding of the nature of historical inquiry.
Right. He also draws a distinction between behavior and conduct.
Right. So behavior is just what people do,
Okay.
while conduct is what people do intentionally.
Okay, so it's about the meaning that people attach to their actions.
Exactly. And Oakeshott thinks that history is about understanding conduct, not behavior.
Okay, and he says that the human sciences are doubly interpretive.
Right. Because we're not just trying to understand what people did, but also what they thought they were doing.
Right, so we have to interpret their actions in light of their beliefs and intentions.
Exactly. And Oakeshott sees this as a fundamental difference between the human sciences and the natural sciences.
Right, the natural sciences are about explaining events in terms of cause and effect,
Right.
while the human sciences are about understanding events in terms of meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And this is why Oakeshott thinks that the methods of the natural sciences can't be applied to the human sciences.
Okay. And he places himself within that German intellectual tradition that we talked about earlier,
Right.
that was concerned with distinguishing the human sciences from the natural sciences.
Right. Thinkers like Windelband Rickert and Dilthey. And Oakeshott agrees with them that the human sciences need their own distinct methods.
Okay. And he also argues that understanding conduct can be systematic.
Right. He's not saying that we can't find any patterns in human behavior.
Okay.
But he's saying that these patterns are not like the laws of nature.
Oh.
They're more like rules of thumb or generalizations.
And he also emphasizes that we need to be careful not to reduce human conduct to its biological or material underpinnings.
Right. He thinks that this kind of reductionism misses the point of the human sciences.
Right, which is to understand the meaning and purpose of human action.
Exactly.
And Oakeshott is particularly skeptical of sociology as a distinct discipline.
Yeah. He thinks that sociology tries to study society as if it were a thing in itself.
Okay.
But Oakeshott doesn't think that society is a thing. It's just a collection of individuals interacting with each other.
Okay, and so he thinks that sociology is trying to study something that doesn't really exist.
Right. He thinks that the proper subject of the human sciences is intelligent conduct, meaning actions that are guided by thought and deliberation.
Okay, and he also says that the humanities interpret human acts in relation to established practices.
Right. So we're always trying to understand what people are doing in light of the social norms and conventions of their time.
Right, and Oakeshott thinks that this is how we make sense of human action.
Exactly. It's how we understand the meaning and significance of what people do.
Now, Oakeshott also rejects the positivist covering law model of historical explanation.
Right. So the positivists thought that we could explain historical events by subsuming them under general laws.
Okay.
But Oakeshott thinks that this is a mistake because historical events are unique and contingent.
Right.
They can't be explained by appealing to some kind of universal law.
Okay.
And so for Oakeshott, historical explanation is about understanding the particular chain of events that led to a specific outcome.
Okay, and he emphasizes that the historians' organizing concepts are just that, concepts.
Yeah.
They're not real entities that exist in the past.
Exactly. They're just tools that historians use to make sense of the past.
Right, and Oakeshott also emphasizes that historical knowledge is constructed from evidence.
Right. It's not something that we just discover. It's something that we create.
Right, and he says that a historical fact is what the evidence requires us to believe.
Exactly. It's not just a brute fact. It's a conclusion that we reach based on our interpretation of the evidence.
And Oakeshott also says that the historical past is present,
Right.
meaning that it's always being reinterpreted in light of new evidence and new perspectives.
Exactly. History is not a static thing. It's always evolving.
Right, and Oakeshott distinguishes between the scientific past and the historical past.
Right. So the scientific past is the past as understood by science.
Okay.
It's a past of physical events and processes.
Okay.
While the historical past is the past as understood by history.
Right.
It's a past of human actions and intentions.
Okay, and Oakeshott also critiques Collingwood's idea of reenactment.
Right. So Collingwood thought that the historian had to get inside the heads of the people they were studying
Okay.
and relive their experiences. But Oakeshott thinks that this is impossible.
Right.
He thinks that we can never fully understand the past from the perspective of the people who lived it.
Right. We always bring our own perspectives and biases to our understanding of the past.
Exactly. And so for Oakeshott, historical understanding is always partial and incomplete.
Okay. And he also rejects Collingwood's claim that all philosophy is the philosophy of history.
Right. He thinks that this is a form of historicism,
Yeah.
which is the belief that all knowledge is relative to its historical context.
Right. And Oakeshott thinks that this is a mistake.
Exactly. He thinks that there are some truths that are timeless and universal.
Okay, so that's Oakeshott's philosophy of history.
Right.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about Oakeshott's theory of modes of experience, his critique of rationalism, his idea of civil association, and his philosophy of history.
Yeah, and I think we've seen how these ideas can be really useful for philosophers who are trying to understand the world.
Right? His work offers a really rich and nuanced framework for thinking about the nature of knowledge, the limits of reason, and the relationship between theory and practice.
And I think it's especially relevant today when we're facing so many complex challenges that require us to think critically and creatively.
Right. And so we hope that this deep dive has given you some new insights and some new tools for approaching these challenges.
Absolutely. And we encourage you to keep exploring Oakeshott's work and see what other insights you can find.
And as a final thought, we want to leave you with this question. Given Oakeshott's emphasis on the autonomy of modes of experience, how might this framework influence your approach to interdisciplinary philosophical inquiry,
Right.
particularly when you're engaging with fields like political science or history?
Exactly. How do you navigate the different languages and the different assumptions of these different fields?
Right. And how do you avoid making category mistakes?
Right.
It's a question that Oakeshott himself grappled with, and it's one that we think is worth continuing to ponder.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.